Welcome to Paul or Nothing, the place to get all of your Paul all of the time. Join me, your host Sam Wiles, as we discover the history, the music, and the man behind it all, Paul McCartney. To get in contact with the show, email us at paulmccartneypod@gmail.com. The thrill of the live performance, the big show, is one that's been a constant allure for McCartney from childhood and seemingly an addiction ever since those early gigs as a teenager. It's a good thing too. McCartney, out of all the Beatles, was at most at home on the stage, and the first real example of this on a wider scale would probably be the debut of the Macca Magnus opus that is Yesterday on the Ed Sullivan Show in '64, and it's clear from that moment on that McCartney was meant to do this for the rest of his life, and more importantly, had the ability to do it on his own. He has this almost inexhaustible enthusiasm for the work that he does. Despite what you may think about Paul lazing around in a Pineapple Express haze in the studio, you can never deny his true dedication to the craft of putting on a damn good live show. Check out any of his live performances, whether on DVD or YouTube, and try and disagree with that sentiment. You can't. Though what also quickly becomes clear is that many elements of his live shows were formulated as far back as the early 70s, as we'll be discussing later. Is that a sign of a tried and tested success, or is it getting a little bit old hat by now? As always, that is up to you. To this day, we still have the fireworks with Live and Let Die, and it's never going away. You don't need to fix what isn't broken, it's all part of the plan. You only need to look at Paul's current touring schedule to see how constantly Paul's live itch has to be scratched. The world is not enough, the screams can never end. McCartney has, through much hard work, secured himself an eternal gig where now he never has to worry about being on the stage. He can always find a gig somewhere. He said himself that they'll be wheeling him out when he's 90 anyway, and I seriously don't doubt him. Wherever people begin to build an argument that shines a positive light on Wings, one of the first things they point out is that Wings were, from the very beginning, a solid live act. Some of the band's early live material almost made its way onto the band's originally double-disced second album, Red Rose Speedway, in the form of The Mess, Soily, and 1882. More on that on our bonus episode on Red Rose Speedway, coming out very soon also. But alas, the studio at the time thought it was more appropriate to push McCartney in a jumper that his nan had knitted him with some weak love songs for the album instead. And then, till 1976, with the constantly shifting band lineups, family life and studio politique, Wings had almost entirely been a studio band with a couple of European and British tours here and there, but nothing that substantial. And it's almost a waste of their potential and a waste of our time, really. On vinyl, Paul has been interested in capturing that raw and live sound, not unlike the sound that made Please Please Me so famous and energetic, during the Get Back, Let It Be sessions. Though the Beatles weren't really up for this, so when Wings first got together, the first album, Wildlife, was recorded a la Bob Dylan's Basement Tape Sessions, which kind of also has a pseudo-live one-take, two-take feel. But no, it wasn't totally live, and it also wasn't that successful. History would dictate that it would take another 6 years for Paul to utilise the band's greatest strength and capitalise on it, even though that was the very element that drew him to forming Wings in the first place. And now here we are. He has presented us with an image of the band that he's been building up for 7 years now. But he really does have to deliver something, not just for now, but for the ages, something for podcasters to talk about in 2017. Band on the Run may have saved Wings, but this was to legitimise it. All he has to do is not fuck it up. No pressure then, eh? Hello there, folks, and welcome to Paul or Nothing, where, as you probably guessed by now, is the place to get all your Paul all of the time. We are a podcast dedicated to the exploration of Paul McCartney, both as a man and musician, all taking place after 1970. Of course, we don't talk too much about the Beatles on here if we can help it. Today we have another monumental episode on our hands. Literally, the product that we are discussing today is a weighty amount of vinyl indeed. We are, of course, not discussing London Town, as we should have done in the schedule. Obviously, Morris's episode came out a while back, but the live triple disc extravaganza that is Wings Over America. I just want to start this episode by thanking you, thanking everyone out there, all of you in the world, no matter where you're from, no matter how you listen to this, whether you send in emails, if you're on the Twitter, if you comment on the YouTube pages, if you follow the blog, or even if you're one of the very kind few that supports us on our Patreon page. Thank you all out there so much. You are the lifeblood of this show. If you want to help keep the show going, you can always help contribute in new and exciting ways. Drop us an email at paulmccartneypod@gmail.com. Please tell me your Paul McCartney story. How did you get into Paul? Are there any facts or trivia nuggets that you have that I haven't touched? Maybe maybe there's an album review that you have agreed or disagreed with, maybe even want to warn me about an album in the future, please drop us an email at paulmccartneypod@gmail.com. You can find us on Twitter, which is @McCartneyPod. That's kind of the hub for the show. I've been a bit lax with it lately, actually. I do need to get back on the Twitter. I do have a lot of fun with that. The Facebook page and the YouTube page, it's very, very simple. Just type in Paul or Nothing or Paul McCartney Podcast. You'll find me there. There's the blog, which is www.paulmccartneypod.wordpress.com. I've just released a new article, the top 11 Paul McCartney bass lines, though I believe that's the 14th article now, so there should be a wide variety of other album reviews, alternative albums, song analyses, anything to kind of whet your Paul McCartney beak, stuff that I kind of couldn't fit into the show, and many of the articles will eventually become bonus episodes as well, so it's a good way for you to kind of get that early content, though I will try and change it up a little bit for the actual episodes. And last but certainly not least, if you're a fan of the show in any way, if you feel like the show deserves some recognition, if you want to help support the show in a small way, help us expand, help us grow, maybe new mics, new equipment, maybe get some better guests on, or maybe you just want to thank me for the work that I do for free. This show will always be for free. There'll never be any ads or anything like that. If you want to help support the show, please find us on our Patreon page, which is www.patreon.com/McCartneyPodcast. That's www.patreon.com/McCartneyPodcast. And now that we've got that out of the way, it's time for my third full rendition of recording this episode. Some of you may even be aware that my friend Tom, who I used to do Down in the Hole with, I've actually appeared on his podcasts Alpha Metallica and Battle Rap Resume very, very recently, but Tom actually recorded this episode with me about 2 months ago in the original schedule. Due to certain technical errors and Tom's lack of availability now, this has had to be re-recorded, and we're kind of going to do this one on the fly, folks, even though this is one of the larger episodes. Maybe it'll be better because I've done it before, who knows. Now, just off the bat, I want to say that this is not going to be the encyclopedic coverage of the Wings Over the World tour. All of the history surrounding the European and Australian and said supposed Japanese legs of the tour have already been covered, extensively of course, on our Wings at the Speed of Sound episode. But as a little recap, for the listeners' sake, yours and mine to some degree, let's have a quick little recap. It sounds kind of corny to say that the story of Wings America is kind of the story of Wings itself. As we know, Paul's wanted to go back on the stage since at least '68 and has had varying degrees of success ever since, doing little university tours of England, stuff like that. They weren't really very, very popular at all, didn't have much street cred. Bam! Band on the Run comes out. They have to capitalise on this. So Paul starts working on Venus and Mars to create a set list with enough hit songs to base a tour off. They started off in Southampton, England, and embarked on a tour of various legs of Europe and Australia, and then unfortunately, due to customs, the Japanese leg of the tour was cancelled. This meant that the band took a couple of months off for vacation and to squeeze out another album, which was Wings at the Speed of Sound. Check out our episode on that, before the next leg of the tour was due to start. Now, whilst this did break the momentum of the tour somewhat, it did give the band, with some members who were kind of growing weary of the set-in-stone set list anyway, a chance to unwind, smoke some mad reefer with Paul, and rehearse. Also, off the new album would come 4 songs that would go onto the set list as well. Now, a band leader is only as good as his band. Not that Paul would ever call himself the band leader, but he is. But one of Wings' biggest hurdles was the fact that the lineup changed more times than you can count. This meant Paul, Denny and Linda, whilst being a close-knit threesome, struggled to gain a rapport with the wider band. However, we now have the additions of the young Glaswegian guitarist Jimmy McCulloch and the big hairy Joe English on drums. And they've been here for a whole 2 albums now. So, shock of horrors, they actually feel like a band. And they've just come off this massively successful Venus and Mars album. None of them have left. And this element is infinitely significant, as it meant that this version of the band had a more steady rehearsal time than any incarnation before. They even went so far as to do a couple of little dress rehearsals for the Rich and Famous in Elstree Studios in London, and you can actually listen to clips of that, excerpts of that, on the JimmyMcCullochFan channel. More on who JimmyMcCullochFan is later. You could tell he was nervous about opening himself up as a showman to the rest of the world again, especially America, and he was going to take these rehearsals very seriously. When talking about the band's rehearsal sessions, Paul said, "It's better than I thought it would be. We'd been worried that we'd be over-rehearsed. We haven't played for anybody in years, and we were all a bit nervous. We rehearsed the band down in Rye, Sussex, England. We learnt all the numbers." Linda too was aware of Paul's reservations about the band, or should I say, past versions of Wings, when she says, "Paul didn't feel confidence in the band before, whereas with this lineup, he knows that he can really get up there and sing, because he knows that everyone else knows what they're doing. With this, we've listened to it and criticised it. Denny has been with us always, and he's always fit in. Henry McCulloch didn't really fit in, though. Jimmy is great, however, and I think he'll improve a lot. He'll get better and really get into his own style. And Joe English is simply a very good drummer who's never done anything big before. He's great on rhythm, and he doesn't come on like, I'm a great drummer. He just gets behind it. You can't ever say what's going to be in the future, but I'd like to see this version of Wings carry on. Now, this is the start of a series of kind of famous last statements about this lineup of Wings, and some of that was covered in our London Town episode as well. Obviously, Linda is Paul's ultimate confidant, and of course she knows this. But I guess it's just so odd for me and disarming to see someone like Paul, a veritable master of the art form, to still be plagued by the mortal feelings of self-doubt and worry. But what she does say raises an interesting point. What if Paul had gone to America with a less polished, less rehearsed, earlier incarnation of the band, a Henry McCulloch version perhaps? Well, it may very well have killed the band dead there and then. One of the best things about Wings' conquest of America is that they did, to some extent, play it slow, play it safe, and they didn't blow their load too soon. The fact that they stayed in England and Europe and honed their craft meant they hit the floor running when they landed in the US, rather than stumbling for 5 years in the UK. I guess the point to take from all this is that if Wings were a live band to be reckoned with when they were a shambles, then this incarnation of the band would be unstoppable. And to his credit, what's really telling is the sheer consistency between the shows. Regardless of whether this is going to be an album or not, this was a polished product. End of. Paul made sure that there were cameras all over this tour, and there is an orgy of evidence of footage of Wings playing this setlist, and it's identical every time. Whether it's footage from Wings over the world and in Australia with a slightly different setlist, or if it's the album itself, bootlegs, or maybe even the live film Rock Show, which we reviewed in one of our early film review episodes. The band will deliver and make sure that the ravenous audience get the same high-octane, overly long extravaganza, no matter where or when they see it. The fact that Paul has created such a rigid, set-in-stone, almost operatic set list meant that some of the more exuberant and creative band members, like I say, were again starting to suffer, and it seems like every episode there's a little update on the antics of lead guitarist Jimmy McCulloch, and whilst at first I kind of assumed he just liked a bit of a drink, and he was a young and boisterous guy, he does seem to be kind of one of those friends who's a bit of a knob, but you keep him around anyway. And as we've seen in the last few episodes, he's tended to push things. The big one is how much of an old man he kind of made Paul feel during the tour. I can't find the exact quote, but it's the idea that Family Man Paul was, he might do a bumper coat before the show and a big old doobie after. But when it was time for bed and there was a time to act professional, young Jimmy would be yelling and shredding on his guitar till the wee hours of the morning and partying and causing fights and getting into trouble. Like, Paul got that out of his system when he was younger, and he does care about professionalism, and gossip does travel fast, and Jimmy does tend to cock things up a lot. There was another story from Mark Lewisham's Wingsman Companion Guide where the tired and overly intoxicated Jimmy couldn't even be asked to come out back on stage and do the classic Wings encore of Hi 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 and Soily, forcing a presumably crimson-faced McKay to storm down to the dressing room, give Jimmy a right bollocking in the way the boss man really can, and then drag him back out onto stage, presumably by his ear. Personally, I like to picture Paul, with his Rickenbacker bass still in hand, rolling his eyes as he catches Jimmy on all four, nose deep in some Tony Montana-style coke. It seems that Jimmy, like Henry, is going to find his departure from the band equally as forthcoming and obvious. Either way, Paul was very clearly excited about the prospect of being back in America after all these years, and relive some of those ego-expanding Shea Stadium insanities. Paul knew he was still big in the States and would be welcomed with open arms, but he was also aware of the expectations that would now be imposed upon him, especially since that the live album would be from this leg of the tour, so there could be literally no room for error. Now, they did think ahead, and the tour dates were arranged in such a way as to combat this, making America the last leg of the tour, so they didn't throw themselves in the deep end. Paul said, "In England, the normal venue is like 3,000 people capacity. So naturally, we started off with 3,000, then we went on to 5,000, 6, 14,000 in Australia. Then we played some of the bigger halls in Europe, which were more like 15,000. I like doing things like that, step by step." This is very reminiscent of the Beatles' Tales of Hamburg, where the Beatles, or the Silver Beatles as they were known back then, got their 10,000 hours of practice live on stage, except that Paul's kind of doing it on a much more expensive and grander scale. But by the time this phase 2 of the tour began, the fervour in America had started to bubble. Band on the Run, Venus and Mars and Wings at the Speed of Sound had all been smash #1 albums for the group, and for the first time ever, they had some genuine street cred before they arrived somewhere. However, this did have a downside. The fact that Paul had not been in the major spotlight in the States whilst with Wings meant that he really hadn't had a chance to lay down the groundwork to allow himself to distance himself from the Beatles and secure an image as a member of Wings. Despite all the admirations for Paul's new band, he was always, of course, going to be harassed and harangued by overly Beatleified questions in interviews, driving him mad, and he would also have to accept that a reasonable amount of the ticket buyers would be going purely because Paul was a Beatle, and he would reward them handsomely with 5 Fab 4 tracks. However, it became increasingly clear that Beatlemania was still adamant in the States, and it was still alive, and it was at risk of overshadowing this band on the run. In '76, the 9-year contract that the Beatles had with EMI came to an end. However, EMI retained the rights to reissue anything that they'd issued during that time. So it released the singles collection, 1962 to 1970. This meant every radio station seemed to play nothing but Beatles material, and Paul was once again reminded of the overriding stigma on this second band. This was then amplified by various outrageous offers that were being made at the time for the Beatles reformation. Stories of $1 million each, 10 million each, like real ABBA type numbers, especially for the day. But none of them were having it, especially not Paul, who now had too much to prove anyway. But to paraphrase Ronnie Wood, Paul had his own tour to do anyway, and the Beatles were not his number one priority. Though, when the band stepped into a new town, again, like I say, there would be this junket of people who would kind of get a couple of Wings questions out the way, and then they would just bring up the Beatles. Eventually, it would have to start with Paul or Paul's press set office, or even Linda saying, please, no more Beatles questions. To kind of sum up Paul's answers about the Beatles, I picked this quote. We don't throw eggs at each other anymore, but there is nothing left of the Beatles. Nothing except memories and some good tunes. I don't think the Beatles will ever reform. In fact, I'm pretty sure they won't. It's hard to try following the Beatles. However, the feeling of being on stage is not much different from the feelings I had when I was working with the Beatles. It terrifies me. I'm always thinking of whether I'll be doing the song justice, or what's going to happen when I get back to the hotel. They do scream at our concerts, but they don't scream as much. Now they could hear the music. It wasn't within my power to bring back the Beatles. It was a 4-way split, and we wanted to do different things. Fortunately, I'm out working, and an interviewer asked me what there was left to achieve. As if I've done it all. And Linda, Paul's ever defender, added, they'll be asking if the Beatles will reform when we're old and grey. I think they'll go on asking those questions forever. I think it's important that in an age of cynical post-Wings negativity that the band were undoubtedly popular in the States. Massively so. Whether this was purely due to the fact that Paul McCartney, a quarter of the most famous band of all time, was the lead member, is kind of irrelevant now that as this is '76, Wings were no longer a band with seldom few hits, but a grizzled stage act, recent veterans of a long European tour that had a long stream of massive hits and hit albums to draw upon. The band were tight and had genuinely earned the massive audience that awaited it, which was reflected in the record sales. It had taken 6 years, 5 albums, 4 separate lineups, get to this point, and it's right within Paul's grasp. The best possible way I can set the stage for the real anticipation for this tour, the mass hysteria over the Wings Over America tour, is to read to you an extract from an article also titled Wings Over America by Mark Gross for Blast magazine in August '76. Just listen to how the writer kind of builds this seemingly endless horde of fans that are biting at the bit to get a chance to see Paul. Remember, there is no guarantee that Paul would return to America swiftly, if at all. And seeing that it was now over a decade since the last tour, people were almost panicking. And America is a very, 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 very big place, do not forget. And there was only a set amount of dates, a set amount of tickets, and perhaps a certain amount of exclusivity helped create this fervour. Gross begins. 7th Avenue looked like a refugee camp for the great unwashed. On 33rd Street, the crowd was even thicker, pinned in between the Bookmasters on the corner and Madison Square Gardens, looking like a big bad dream result of Dylan's leopard skin pillbox hat and a pepperoni pizza. Looming large across the street, cutting off the light, making the cops uptight. No great announcement had been made. The Knicks were in last place, so the crowd definitely wasn't there for a playoff ticket. It had to be a Beatle. And of course it was. Paulie, he was the reason that the great unwashed masses came to be shoved, funneled, fleeced and released. And even as they pushed towards the besieged ticket windows that wouldn't open for hours, they smiled, knowing that there would be a rock show. For the first time since San Francisco's Candlestick Park in '66, McCartney was coming back, boarding his newly sprouted wings. The crowd, some of whom had been waiting all night and day, began to get restless. As TV network cameras whirled, they broke through the police barriers just from their sheer pressure of numbers. Forced into an underpass by police, they lined up 7 deep in a snaky column that eventually encircled the entire garden. Rings of police kept them in a semblance of order, but one cop still admitted to a reporter, "I was scared to death." At 3:10 in the afternoon, WNE WFM announced that the tickets were on sale, and it seemed as if all of Manhattan converged on the garden within minutes. Finally, the windows opened, crowds snaked through the intricate maze, and about 10 at a time were allowed to approach the windows. The show sold out in 4 hours, and thousands of people were left ticketless. One person who got his tickets was Louis Pacifico, 18, of Garfield, New Jersey, the first person to leave the windows. Pacifico leaped into the air, ran around the lobby, and made it clear that this day was the second best day of his life. The best day would come when Paulie played. "I've been waiting for this as long as I can remember," he told reporters. They smiled and nodded. Even for ones who'd grown up on the band called the Beatles, it seemed quite true. The entire tour sold out naturally, and the band played a total of 30 gigs in 20 locations, all American save one in Toronto, Canada. It all lasted from the 3rd of May to the 23rd of June, and by the end of it, an ungodly amount of money had been made, and I'm sure enough to set Denny Lane up to dodge taxes for the rest of his life. The show itself is pretty badass, but when you go back and look at the display work and pyrotechnics that McCartney has today, or even the most basic band today, you see how quaint and basic it feels by proxy. It was also the first time for another McCartney staple to rear its head, and that was Paul having a live brass section to support him. Okay, it wasn't massive, it was just 4 or 5 guys depending on the gig, with a couple of trumpets and saxophones. But fortunately, it was organised by Wings regular and true Macca sound innovator Howie Casey. Now, to put it in context for you, and in some ways Paul McCartney's sound had become more delicate and more nuanced, but in other ways it had become more brash. And songs like Time to Hide, Live and Let Die, even Bluebird just wouldn't have been the same without a live brass section there. One of the notable features of the track list is the addition of something that up until now McCartney had been reluctant, stubbornly so, to include in a Wings live show, and that is of course Beatles songs, which we will obviously get into in a moment when I get my guest on. But to add a twist to the proceedings that many may have missed when simply glancing across the back cover of the credits, that they were to McCartney-Lennon rather than Lennon-McCartney. This is big shit, folks. It has been Lennon and McCartney ever since, 61? Now, you might think this is where the inciting incident occurs, but actually nothing happens and no one bats an eye. But when Paul does it again in his 2002 album, Back in the US, the estate of Lennon and Ono went absolutely tits berserk. However, this may have been a bitter move on their part, as McCartney during the anthology series, the anthology re-release, which is such a fantastic monumental piece of art, did also try and swap certain songs like Yesterday and a couple of others to being McCartney-Lennon, and this is either Yoko Ono being a bit defensive about John's legacy, maybe it's a rights issue, maybe she's protecting her own financial interests, but you never know. This just could be simply her taking a jab at Paul after all these years, despite the kind of peace that we're kind of told that exists between them now. What was clear about this American leg of the tour, though, is that, by God, the setlist was much stronger than the previous tours. I mean, coming off a rare streak of 3 very well, frankly, massively well-received albums, as well as several mega-hit singles since '73, meant that they had a wealth of songs to choose from. The only real distinction between these set lists, between the 2 phases of the tour that I can tell, is that in the '75 kind of UK, Australian, European leg of the tour, there were a couple of the minor hits for the more hardcore Wings fans sprinkled in, like we had Sea Moon, Little Woman Love, and even Junior's Farm, which were real staples of the Phase 1 Wings lineup prior to '76. Basically, all of these songs were just replaced by things that were recorded during Wings at the Speed of Sound, and to make it nice and tidy, they were even just put on one side of a disc as well. I do feel like there's a distinctive lack of Ram on this album, something like, I'm not even going to say Monkberry Moon Delight, just something nice like Ram On or Too Many People, Backseat in My Car. A lot of these songs that could have been performed really well by a tightly wound Wings. And, there's not anything off Wildlife either. Like, again, do not play Mumbo, but it would have been quite weird for Paul to sing Dear Friend, perhaps. I am rather immune to the hype of Junior's Farm, so I'm glad that we have Beware My Love in its place. Now, if you don't want to hear any spoiler alerts on what songs Paul chose from Wings at the Speed of Sound to include, skip ahead 10 seconds now. The songs were Denny Lane's Time to Hide, Silly Love Songs, Let 'Em In, and Beware My Love. Now, without giving too much away of the album review section of the show, I will say that these are not exactly curveball or unexpected choices. Paul was clearly picking the cream of the crop from a kind of mediocrely bland album to include in the tour. That being said, you might be surprised to find out that Band on the Run was only represented by no more than 5 songs. This may be due to the fact that the lion's share of the airtime was taken up by a whopping 8 songs from Venus and Mars, which does show that McCartney did complete his assessment objective by creating an album to fill a live show. Well done, Paul, you did it. But we didn't need Call Me Back Again. But more on that later. The apparent democratic turn for the band was also heading into positive waters. It was actually managed to work its way into the live shows. Originally, Denny Lane and Jimmy McCulloch had songs much later in the set list. Much later. Now, with this release, Denny and Jimmy have the 3rd and 4th song. That's if you count Venus and Mars Rock Show and Jet as one song. But yeah, they're both on the first disc. Wow, that is a massive step up and a right display of faith on the part of Paul. Denny Lane has 4 lead vocal spots on this album, and even a shared vocal on Picasso's Last Words. We have one that he wrote with Paul, which is Spirits of Ancient Egypt, one that he wrote himself, Time to Hide, one that one of his bandmates has written years ago, which is The Moody Blues Go Now, which is still my favourite ever rendition of that song, and even a cover. Yes, they even managed to find a cover on this album as well, which was the surprise hit for me, actually. The song Richard Cory from Simon and Garfunkel's second album, Sounds of Silence. Luckily for Macaphiles like me, there was also a hell of a lot of supplementary material surrounding this tour, meaning that there was no part that wasn't documented. This is the most filmed portion of the band's career. Band on the Run was the hit, but no one cared about them at the time they were actually making it. But now they had all the hype that went with that success. And the notable extras that I would highly recommend that all of you watch will be the aptly named documentary Wings Over the World, and also Rock Show, and maybe even check out One Hand Clapping as well. Even after the tour ended, the actual making of the album was also equally both interesting and difficult. So after the tour ends, you would think McCartney would like to take some time to chill out and recuperate after such an intensive road lifestyle. But no, this is Paul McCartney, of course. He's going to carry on throwing himself into his work, like our guest Howard Soon said many episodes ago, in our second bonus episode actually. You don't become Paul McCartney unless you wake up and be the best every day, and Paul is still showing that exemplary skill time and time again. He comes back from America to Britain to work on the album, immediately winds up in Abbey Road Studios, and again, rather than letting an engineer or some spotty intern bring in the best of the tapes, he starts personally sifting through over 70 hours worth of audio tapes, spanning the 14 hours a day in the studio, becoming a real kind of reclusive hermit, which also caused some friction between him, Linda and the kids. But yeah, Paul was going to make sure that there was not a single mistake. This was going to be a perfect Wings product. However, one of the bigger controversies surrounding this time was, and it was kind of swirling around the rumour publications of the day, probably Melody Maker, was that a lot of what we were about to hear on the album was actually not purely a live performance, but would be heavily overdubbed. This isn't true. There were overdubs. Most live albums have an overdub here or there somewhere. Just a couple of backing vocal parts that you might not have been able to pick out particularly, or maybe a guitar had a bum note here or there. But it's not like whole vocal melodies are being rearranged and whole drum beats are being edited out and edited back in. No, there were a few minor things here and there, but you can't tell. You really can't. But with Paul becoming some kind of George Lucas, Mr. Burns Hermit King, young Jimmy McCulloch, the troublemaker, found himself very little to do for a couple of months. Yes, that's how long Paul took to record this album. In this time, he formed a trio with his brother Jack and friend Dave Clark, and they were called White Line, which is the most obvious name for a group doing shovelfuls of cocaine per day that has ever been released. They made one single called Call My Name, but the final pressing for a wide release was mysteriously cancelled, perhaps by forces seeking to rein in an already rather wild ragamuffin. After this, Jimmy apparently wandered into one of those pubs in London that more prestigious folk in the music industry may frequent, and he bumps into the Sex Pistols, proceeds to get absolutely pissed as a newt, and starts gobbing off to them, telling them basically how shit they all are, how punk is terrible, which I'd kind of agree with, and starting yet another punch-up, which, in the context, I don't disagree with bandmate Clark and Sex Pistols' original bassist Glenn Matlock having to separate the two. This incident is pretty interesting, if only because Paul would hire the Sex Pistols producer Chris Thomas a couple of years later to work with him on Back to the Egg. Anyway, back to the album. After what seemed like an eternity of mixes and dubs, Paul released the album by December 10th. However, not as originally planned. Originally this was meant to be a more openly modest double disc release, but a bootleg released around this time. They actually managed to get the bootleg out and printed and in certain back alley shops, even before McCartney had got halfway through the mixes. And this bootleg probably changed the course of McCartney's thinking entirely more than any other bootleg in history. Like any large multi-million-dollar industry, Wings has its own fair share of rip-off merchants, merchandise hustlers, pirates, ticket touts and spongers. In fact, if you check out Mark Lewisham's book Wingspan, which I've already mentioned, you can see loads of pictures of fake Wings t-shirts, pins, mugs and salesmen flogging them right outside the very gigs. We don't have eBay and Etsy back then, folks. This was unregulated black market material and was a massive part of the culture, especially bootlegs. Now, one of my favourite bootlegs is called The Lost Tapes for Tom Waits' Alice, which is a pretty insightful listen to the craft of how these songs change because they sound nothing like how they do on the album. But we are very lucky these days as we have YouTube and Spotify. But back then, a bootleg meant if you were sick of and tired of listening to the same old albums on repeat, you wanted to devour some more McCartney, or whether you were unlucky enough to not see the show, maybe there was some inconspicuous man or woman who may or may know a friend of a friend and set up some prior lease and maybe set up some illegal recording equipment in the venue, tape it, print it on some surprisingly legit and sturdy vinyl and sell it on the sly. This backdoor market, this black market backdoor dealerships and their recordings were the holy grail of both fans and collectors, as there was no internet to catch up on what you missed. If you didn't go to the show, you didn't see the fucking show. So there was an inherent value placed on these bootlegs that's unfortunately been lost somewhat. There were many popular Wings bootlegs by this point, loads from their early touring days in Europe. Some of them I'll be actually covering in one of our gig review episodes. And these would still be churned out as late as 1979 with the band's Swan Song era, most of which you can also find on the JimmyMcCullochFan YouTube page, but more on him later. Now, one unifying trait across the whole lot of these Wings bootlegs is that Wings are fucking awesome live. It was the big dirty secret of rock, or pop, depending on vinyl. Wings were kind of like an overblown pop band, but live they were an out-and-out rock band. And it's a bit of an embarrassment for a lot of people that this lightweight, overly sentimental, dance hall singer, songwriter, vaudeville impersonator could put on one of the best fucking live rock shows of the time, and now they have that street cred. The bootleg in question was called Wings from the Wings, the last show for the 1975-76 World Tour, live at the LA Forum, June 23rd, 1976. Phew, that was a mouthful. But in essence, it is the prelude to what would become Wings Over America. Wings from the Wings boasted a whopping 3-disc collection that essentially laid out the entire gig from start to finish, and it had an almost mirror image of the track listing on Wings Over America. Obviously, the set lists were very, very similar. Like, I was expecting to be similar, the actual recordings, but Paul plays the exact same show twice. There are almost literally no differences. Even with the actual overdubs and additions Paul put on the final album, it still makes it very similar to Wings from the Wings. What was cool about this bootleg though was that it had a red, white and blue set of coloured vinyl discs, which reflected the fact that Wings' last show in the US was also on the country's 200-year bicentennial celebration. Wings Over America indeed. So if that sounded cool to you, it'll be no surprise that the bootleg was indeed a smash hit, and it's a shame really that no such records are kept of these illegal products, but it was enough of a success to catch the attention of Macca, who, like I said, was originally planning to make a double album, so he decided to make it into 3, which greatly expands the set list. You have a chance to sneak in a few obscure hits and a few other big ones as well that people may have missed. And whilst it does kind of take away some of the mystique, perhaps, of the live performance, like giving you that kind of incentive to go see him live, you cannot imagine Wings Over America any other way now. But the impact of the album does not just end there. Despite the album's recording engineer picking the 5 best versions of each song across the whole tour, and they were sifting through 80 hours of material, spending 14 hours a day, like I said, almost all the material chosen for Wings Over America was coincidentally, you can't see my fingers but they're doing the quotations thing, coincidentally taken from the June 23rd show that was used in Wings from the Wings. Now, it's the exact same. It's the exact same show. There may be a few differences here and there, but the bulk of it, 95+%, is all the same. Though I'm not really sure who is stealing from who at this point. It's a product imitating art, imitating life, imitating art, imitating another product. I really don't know what's going on. When Paul talked about this process, he said, "That had to be a triple album in the end, because we were doing 2-hour shows, and there's no way to get 2 hours of music on record. This album just called to be a triple album. If we could have made it a double album, we would have made it a double album. I don't like releasing huge price items. I prefer everything to cost 50p. I'm not in just for profit, in spite of what some people think. This bloke who works with handicapped children wrote to us saying the album was one of the things that really lifted the children, and he wanted to thank us for that." I'm not sure why Paul had to slip in the little comment about helping handicapped children happy. That's a little bit of an ego rub on his own part there. But it's clear that, at least in the version of history that Paul wants to present, it was definitely his own decision to make it into a triple album, though the Titanic release of Wings from the Wings is undeniable proof that Paul was at least heavily influenced by that album in his decision to make it a triple disc. So let's briefly talk about the album cover, which is a segment that we consistently forgot to do on Down in the Hole, and it's been a tradition that I've kind of dutifully upheld on this show as well. I always try to remember to talk about the album covers, but as you know, they are the first thing you see. It is the thing that will hopefully attract you into experiencing the vinyl. It is the initial thing that attracts you to the experience of Wings Over America. It was designed by the then and the still legendary Hipgnosis, which is actually spelled as an amalgamation of the words hip and gnostic, as in GNOSTIC, which is great for us fans of wordplay. And it's meant to be the door opening on the side of an aeroplane with the band inside, and there's kind of like an anticipation feel, like, ooh, what's going to happen, where are they? And it does sell that very well. If it is a little bit bland, perhaps I would have wanted something a little bit more bombastic, not like Sgt. Pepper or Dark Side of the Moon or anything. Dark Side of the Moon was also done by Hipgnosis, as well as a lot of T-Rex's albums as well. But I'd say it's better than the other 2 McCartney albums that Hipgnosis would do later on, which was Wings at the Speed of Sound and Tug of War. Or did they do Wings Greatest as well? Maybe even Back to the Egg as well. I'll have to check that one out. They had full artistic license though, Hipgnosis. That was their That was their unique thing. And they were basically, when they would have spent all this time and money on making this album cover, they'd go to the artist and tell them to pay what they thought it was worth. And because of this, and well, this genius business move, they are now bankrupt, unfortunately. Perhaps that wasn't the best business model. Perhaps they should have released an app or something. The inner sleeve, though, for this, I remember when I bought this vinyl in Scarborough on a trip with Amy, and well, firstly, when I lifted the thing, it was so heavy. I could not believe how much they'd packed into this product. And when I opened it, I'd never seen the interior of this album. And honestly, going back to, I used to draw so much when I was at school, and I really, I love graphic novels now and comic books, and the inner artwork in this is simply stunning. It was a real treat. I'd never seen it, like I say, and it's a wonderfully colourful and poppy representation of the band live. They're all drawn in exquisite detail. Danny looks great, Jim looks great, Joe looks great, even Linda looks great, and of course, it really made me want to put the album on as soon as possible. The actual album sleeves that are inside the cardboard as well, they all have the kind of slit of the door opening wider and wider as you go through the disc, and it kind of signifies, so, side 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6. Let's talk about the critical reception for the album, though. And the main criticism levied against this album was not one of music critique or anything like that. It was actually its cost. And Paul was talking about earlier how he wanted to sell things for 50p, like he says, but back in the day, it cost a whopping £6.50, which is kind of the modern equivalent of around £40, maybe like £42. But, obviously Paul had to compete with the bootlegs. He had to get those 3 discs out to us as soon as possible, and perhaps this was the only way possible. Maybe they gave Hypnosis far more money than they deserved. Who knows? Gary Mulholland for Uncut Magazine described Wings Over America as too bloody long, like any triple live album. But it's also a snapshot of Paul McCartney, who, despite some of the Wings album track dross, felt compelled to make a surreal symphonic pop that continued the pop ideals of Sgt. Pepper and the White Album, at least until the following year's Mull of Kintyre showed him just how profitable being Cliff Richard with Beatles gravitas could be in the accursed 1980s. Roy Sheffield for Rolling Stone said, Wings Over America was Paul McCartney's bold arena rock, as opposed to pop move of the 1970s. A triple disc live set, complete with vocal showcases for the backup guys. It was also the first time he remade Beatles oldies. Blackbird and Bluebird fit together well. There's something daft and touching about McCartney, about how McCartney strives for band democracy. Whenever Denny Lane sings lead, you can always hear the fans stampede for their bathroom weed break. Now reissued with a variety of bonus goodies, Wings Over America is a time capsule from a neglected phase of Macca's saga, an artefact for 70s stoners who thought Wings were heavier than the Beatles. Wings Over America went on to sell 4 million copies in the US alone. Wow. And that was according to the Wings biographer about Gary McGee. The album was the first triple release by a group to reach number 1. And at the time, there were, again, couldn't find many contemporary sources, was a critical success at the time. The single was, oddly enough, a single that, up until now, was long overdue. It was Maybe I'm Amazed. For some reason, there was a video made for Maybe I'm Amazed during the McCartney 1 sessions, but it was never released. So this is what most of the world heard before, kind of making the original on the album a bit more of a hidden gem, as it were. But this version, again, things like Coming Up, it's the more popular version. It's the version I'm least comfortable with. It was released as a single on the 4th of February 1977, reached number 10, which is quite respectable in the Billboard Top 100 chart, and it got to number 28 in the UK. So yeah, that's a pretty successful album. Now, before we move on to the actual interview and album review part of the show, I'll be having the JimmyMcCullochFan on very, very shortly. Can't wait to get onto that. Obviously, Tom was meant to be my guest here today, Tom Quee, and unfortunately, obviously he is not, but I do remember we actually watched the entirety of Rock Show when we got very, very, very inebriated indeed at a meeting with a couple of our friends earlier a few months ago. And I remember as he was leaving, he was actually kind of like, excited to listen to Venus and Mars and the Wings Over America album. He thought he was going to have some fun on the bus and on the train and stuff. He'd got it all set up on Spotify, and it only took him about 48 hours to send me the following very foreboding text, which I wanted to read out closer to the critical reception part of the show. It's going to set the tone quite well, I believe. The text is an indicator of what his review of the album would have been, I'm sure, but it says, and I quote, 7 songs deep, and this is such sub-pub rock fodder. Gonna be fun trashing it at least. Now, obviously we're going to get on to the album in a bit more detail, possibly in a little more bit of a positive light now that I've got my new guest on, but to each their own. My friend Morris, who was on in the last episode, London Town, has also tried to convince Tom of this album's sheer brilliance before, and also to no avail. But anyway, let's get on to the live portion of the show. Take it away, me. Hello, and welcome to the live part of the show. We are now, of course, going to be discussing the album in question from here on out. And once again, I am not alone. No, in fact, I'm once again joined by another wonderful guest to help me tap into Wings Over America. Who is my guest, I hear you say? Well, I pretty much met this guy on Facebook, of all places. It sounds very modern and very hipster and very trite, but it was true. And ever since, we've both found out that the other party can pretty much endlessly prattle on about Wings and solo McCartney until the cows come home, which is a very useful trait for one to have. And we've pretty much been in regular contact ever since. And very quickly, I knew I kind of wanted this chap to come on the show, as he's the perfect kind of guy to pick apart a release like this. I'm always trawling through YouTube for ever newer and more obscure, solo McCartney and Wings content, and the channel, dubbed JimmyMcCullochFan, had been on my radar for quite some time, as it offers an almost encyclopedic collection of behind the scenes and early cuts of albums and almost everything that McCartney has ever released as a live show. And it just gives those who are curious enough with a lust for this kind of thing a real insight into the mercurial sound that is McCartney. I cannot recommend the channel enough for all of you out there on YouTube and online. Please subscribe to Jimmy McCulloch Fan. You will get your money's worth. Now, the post that actually connected us wasn't something that I had posted but merely commented on. It was kind of a quick chat review of Tom Doyle's 2013 book, which I'm currently reading now, Man on the Run, Paul McCartney in the 1970s. And in an attempt to gain some closure on one of the odder stories in the Wings mythos that I've come across, I commented saying, and this is something that I've previously mentioned on the show, a tale in which Jimmy McCulloch stayed up all night, perhaps under the influence of some substances, and proceeded to, based on mounting disputes with the McCartneys, winded up pointing a gun at them whilst they slept, either outside their bedroom window or directly in the room. Now, before we carry on, I better introduce the guy before we actually get too deep into this. His name is Paul Salley. He is Jimmy McCulloch Fan, and I couldn't be gladder to have him on the show. Hello, Paul. I'm finally glad to be able to have you on, man. How are you?
I'm doing good, man. How about yourself?
Yeah, I'm pretty good. I'm just enjoying my first day off in 2 weeks, actually, and what better way to celebrate than by discussing possibly, literally the biggest Wings release as we know. So, Paul, could you elaborate on this Jimmy McCulloch rumour, the thing that kind of sparked all of this? You must be able to shed some light on where that started.
Well, it started in the infamous Paul McCartney biography, Blackbird, by Jeffrey Giuliano, who fancies himself as sort of a Beatles expert, but in reality he's nothing more than a tabloid author who makes up stories for his books. So apparently this story came from Denny Lane, but Denny has denied that it ever happened. So who knows what the author was thinking when he wrote it. And then if you read that book and you read that part, it just sounds like a badly written fan fiction, because he goes into things like Jimmy's mindset and things that Jimmy allegedly said, and it's really unbelievable. So honestly, I don't even know why people believe it in the first place, but what you can do.
I mean, it is a very juicy story of this nature. It's like, it would feature on one of those awful online top tens, the things you didn't know that happened to Paul McCartney. But it really never has been verified. I think Jojo Lane may have sold the story to the papers as well. So it kind of makes sense that a very tabloidy guy would be kind of perpetuating that kind of myth. But obviously, we'll never truly know, as the man who was most involved is obviously no longer with us anymore. The thing with the chickens with Jimmy's true, though, isn't it? Where he went into one of Linda's chicken coops and broke all the eggs or something like that, threw them against the wall.
Apparently that one is true. I've talked with a couple of recording engineers from the Mulv Kantara sessions, and they mentioned that a rock and roll incident had taken place the night before they were due to start the Mulv Kantara sessions with the local Pipetown band. I guess Jimmy was there before the night before, but he wasn't there after. So take that for what you will.
Yeah, I can imagine McCartney can whip you off anywhere in about 5 minutes if he truly wants to. And obviously Jimmy McCulloch is missing from the McIntyre single. He has no involvement with it whatsoever.
Well, he did tell friends after it was released that he did play acoustic rhythm guitar on it, and his family does have the awards for the McIntyre and Girls' School single.
Oh, okay, that's interesting. Well, obviously Jimmy's contributions on Girls' School are very pronounced and very obvious. That is one of Jimmy's kind of best songs. It's not one of my personal favourites, but I do get that if you are a fan of Jimmy McCulloch, it's one of the few ones where you can go, yeah, that's where he really gave something to the band.
And there's an interesting interview that Jimmy did with his hometown newspaper in late August, where he actually describes the recording of the McIntyre sessions. So I'll have to send that to you, because it's pretty amazing for a guy that wasn't there for the sessions, being able to describe it in pretty good detail.
Yeah, it is another example possibly of the Macagander, McCartney's ability to kind of rewrite history as the victor, as it were. Obviously there are many elements of his life that kind of get swept under the rug and are a bit hush-hush about and all that. But it is a shame that Jimmy left, because the next album was kind of sorely lacking in a guitar sound, and it wasn't until Lawrence Juba joined the band did the band become a rock band again. Jimmy was one of those elements that made it a true rock band, at least in so far. I've always felt that Wings were a bit of a pop band in Rockskin's clothing, but Jimmy, when Jimmy was there, he did kind of lean it more to a more rocky direction. Speaking of the book in question, the one that I mentioned earlier, Man on the Run, Paul McCartney in the 1970s. The reason, obviously, you reacted so swiftly to my misguided comment was that you had some direct involvement with the book itself. I can actually see your name in the back right now in the thank you section. So what was your involvement with the book?
Pretty much I just helped Tom with research pertaining to Jimmy. I helped him set up a couple interviews with a couple people that knew Jimmy. And then I met him when I was in London. He was working on the book, and I was studying there at the time, so it was perfect timing. We met at a pub, and we just kind of discussed, what he was working on and what I was working on, and just talking about Jimmy and his research that he had done at that point, and how I could possibly help him.
Obviously, we have to address your name in this episode, your moniker, if you will. You are the Jimmy McCulloch fan, and obviously that's a very definite statement for anyone who is into Wings. Not many people would put Jimmy McCulloch as their favourite member of Wings. What draws you so much, or what did draw you initially to the young Scottish guitarist so much?
Well, when I discovered him, I was 13 to 14, so being quite young at the time, and seeing a lead guitar player who was pretty young and had the same sort of slim build as I do, playing with Paul McCartney, had quite an effect on me. And once I heard his solo on Junior's Farm and saw the live video from Wings Over America, it pretty much made me want to learn more about Jimmy. So I was disappointed to learn that at the time there wasn't, a whole lot out there about him, just little blurbs in rock history books. So that sort of piqued my interest and made me want to, do more for him.
Was he the best guitarist Wings ever had, in your opinion?
Oh, there's no doubt.
Okay.
No contest.
You're a fan of this lineup then? Do you think this is the best lineup the band ever had?
Oh, yeah, without a doubt, yes.
Okay.
I think the proof is in the pudding with Wings Over America.
What makes the addition of Jimmy McCulloch and Joe English so starkly different than the other lineups then?
I think it was just Jimmy and Joe's musical abilities, and the whole chemistry of the band seemed to just click when Jimmy and Joe joined. He didn't really get that feeling with Henry McCulloch and Denny Sywall and Jeff Britton before Joe joined. And then after Jimmy and Joe left, I'm sure Paul was fed up with having to have another new lineup, especially one, that was, Wings at their peak, and having to replace Jimmy and Joe. I think Paul just got fed up and wanted to pretty much end the band, and he did, thanks to an incident in Japan.
Yeah, it never seems like they were going to recreate the kind of almost Beatles-esque
furore and excitement when the band was going over the world like that. And like I say, if you saw the band, statistically you saw this lineup. This is the kind of definitive visual statement of the band. There was also the film Rock Show as well, that kind of covers the same subject matter as we're going to be discussing today. I wasn't too much of a fan of that. I thought it was a little bit flat. I'm assuming you've seen that as well.
Yeah, back when Wings Over America was released through the Archive collection, they also released Rock Show as a separate release, but they also released it in theaters for a short run. So I was able to see it on the big screen, and that was that was absolutely incredible. The closest I'll ever get to see Wings. It was amazing, and in my opinion, Rock Show is one of the greatest concert films of all time.
No, I'm glad we have a little bit of a contrast there, because one of the things that came up when I watched it, obviously I'm watching it on a Mac screen. It's nothing amazing. It's not like a big television screen. So I did wonder in that review whether there was something I was missing from not being able to see it on the big screen. I do remember when I saw Let It Be on my Mac, I wasn't very impressed, but I was very fortunate enough at university to watch Let It Be on the big screen, and suddenly something felt a lot more intense and real and dramatic and exciting. So maybe you felt that from Rock Show, seeing it live in the cinema.
Yeah, that's a good comment. I think it's definitely more of an experience seeing it on a theater screen as compared to our laptops or whatever. Mm-hmm. It's more intimate.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much footage that you've uploaded as well, and when you kind of break one of the songs out and you kind of view it out of context, like if you just watch his performance of You Gave Me the Answer from like Wings Over Australia or something, it's nothing inherently amazing, but when you watch the whole show, you kind of experience the whole thing, you do kind of get it. You do know what people are paying for and what kind of show McCartney's trying to put on. It's very big and brash and throwback in that kind of grand way. It seems to me though with Jimmy, I've never thought he was a bad guitarist at all. I think he's quite inventive, especially compared to other guitarists in the band. I mean, even if Lawrence Juber was probably the most proficient, he did seem kind of more of a musician for hire from ideas McCartney had. But with Jimmy, I don't see him as being much of a songwriter without someone else there to prop him up. Like all of his most successful tracks always have either someone else he knew from outside the band or McCartney working with him to kind of prop these tunes up.
Yeah, his main songwriting partner was a guy by the name of Colin Allen, who was Jimmy's bandmate in Stone the Crows. And so what happened there was Colin wrote the lyrics, and he gave the lyrics to Jimmy, who put them to music. And I have a quote from Colin here that I'd like to read. He said that Jim was pretty industrious in that respect, almost like he couldn't get enough lyrics. He definitely had a talent for putting words to music.
I've not become too familiar with Jimmy's work outside of Wings, but he did seem to skip from band to band quite regularly. He never seemed to kind of gain a more iconic status purely because he didn't stay with any particular project for too long. Do you think that's kind of indicative to Jimmy's character? Was he kind of unable to rest with one particular group too long, or was it more just kind of circumstance?
I think it's funny you mentioned that, because Jimmy commented on that himself when he joined Wings. There's a lot of people who were saying, "Oh, he won't stay in the band," because look at his career at that point. He'd been in and out of bands. I think Wings was his longest tenured band. I'm racking my brain here.
It's a good one to have. It's a nice paycheck compared to the others as well.
I think also a lot of that had to do with the fact that he was so young being in bands. So part of it probably the maturity factor and almost always playing with people much older than him. So yeah, Wings was definitely his longest tenured band.
It seemed more like he was more of a reluctant soldier in all of this, really. He kind of knew it was a great business deal for him, but he kind of shared similar traits to Henry McCulloch, really, in that sense where you can kind of tell he's not embarrassed, but he's not particularly proud to show off a lot of his Wings contributions to his friends, except for maybe his two particular songs. Speaking of his two particular songs, what do you think about his movement from Medicine Jar into Wino Junko?
I think Wino Junko is a cool little song. I like all the the special effects on it. You know, the selfish part of me wishes that Wings would have performed it live, so that Jimmy would have gotten 2 songs, because I know Denny got like 3 or 4 songs to sing on Wings Over America. But then again, I do think that Medicine Jar is the crowd pleaser. It's more commercial, I guess you could say, as compared to Wano Junko.
It does feel like Medicine Jar in an alternative dimension could be a classic. It just doesn't stand out enough. Perhaps, you know, it's just missing that little extra piece of magic that would make it a little more iconic. But the fact that he kind of came to the band with that song ready to go, and McCartney was like, oh yeah, okay, cool, throw it on, is a real testament to his ability to write a song, because it took Denny 4 years to get a song on an actual album that was just his own. Obviously Paul co-wrote No Words with him on Band on the Run, so Jimmy kind of broke the record in that sense, I suppose.
Yeah, Medicine Jar was the first non-McCartney song that Paul allowed on a Wings album, so that was pretty cool.
And it does feel like its own thing as well. It does feel like something that exists separately from Venus and Mars, which kind of has this airy, almost Bowie-esque quality. You know, it is very different than what Jimmy was working on, and it does show that the different band members could bring different things together. I mean, I've always felt, especially when you go back and look at Red Rose Speedway and the songs that could have been on the 2-disc album, that Wings were better when they worked as a complete band rather than just, you know, the Paul McCartney show or the main trio. If Jimmy had been in the band longer, I do feel like he could have gotten 2 songs on an album, maybe even 3, and he could have been a definite personality. But maybe, you know, do you feel he was was he too young? Was he too wild to be in a band with McCartney?
I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that Paul is a very dominant personality, and it's his band. So basically, it's his way or the highway, and he didn't really allow Jimmy too much creative freedom musically. So that played an impact on Jimmy wanting to leave, and also, you know, the money situation. Paul didn't pay the band members nearly enough as what they deserved to make. I mean, they still made a pretty nice,
oh yes, of course,
nice little paycheck. I mean, Jimmy bought his own flat thanks to his Wings checks, and he had a Rolls Royce, and you know.
I guess it always feels naive when people join Wings and then leave, because you know what the gig's going to be. You will, like, if you go into the band, and I guess this might be Jimmy's downfall with any other notion that you're not just going to be the Paul McCartney backing band playing songs like Single Pigeon and With a Little Luck for the rest of your life, then you're going to have a problem somewhere down there along the line. I guess, you know, it was always doomed to fail in that sense. What about the rumours that he was a bit of a drug fiend? Is that just McCartney kind of shying attention away from himself a bit?
I believe so. Yeah. I mean, let's be real here. It was the 70s, so you know, Jimmy wasn't a, you know, perfect angel, but you know, he smoked pot, and
yes.
But you know, he wasn't a hard drug user at all. So you know, people like to comment on the fact that Jimmy wrote and sang 2 anti-drug songs in Wings, and then, oh, it's so ironic that he passed away from an overdose. Well, it's not really ironic, because he didn't write the lyrics. I know what those songs are about, and you know, they're not about Jimmy trying to warn himself or whatever you read in the Venus and Mars Archive edition, where Paul, you know, said that. But you know, I do believe that, you know, Jimmy had his, you know, he had his dark side, as we all do, and it's unfortunate what happened, because you know, he was so young, and you know, that's life, I guess.
Everything with the band always seems to be slightly heightened, and everything that does get leaked anyway, you can kind of tell that there might be a certain motivation behind that. And you know, McCartney is the propaganda master. He is the media mogul bar none, really. And the story of Wings is going to be the story as seen by Paul McCartney. We're never going to truly know how maybe irritating or annoying he is to work with, the strains of being in the band. Obviously, if you want to be like Jimmy or Denny and you want to tour and do it live, and Paul wants to take a year off to write some songs, and he's not going to let you do anything else, you're going to get quite bored in that cottage up in Scotland, I imagine. And you can just imagine the scene now. Jimmy's throwing a ball at the wall, and he's wanting to play some guitar, and Paul's just banging away at the piano with some other grandma ditty. You can't really blame him for leaving the band, but it is a shame. Personally, I would have always had Hugh McCracken as the lead guitarist in Wings, but sadly that was never to happen. I literally just listened to Ram today in its full on my vinyl player, and he absolutely contributes something that kind of rivals McCartney a lot more than Jimmy did. And like you just said, Paul possibly was too much of a dominant figure to allow Jimmy to become a kind of Hugh McCracken figure that would add to the sound of Wings as a whole, rather than just contribute little parts that he's allowed to. Before we move on to the actual album, I just want to kind of get some rudimentary questions out of the way. We kind of ask these to all guests on the show to kind of lay the foundations of what you might think about the band and the music in general. Going back a little bit, what is your favourite Beatles album?
Oh gosh,
no one likes that question. Don't worry.
My favorite Beatles album, I'd have to say probably Revolver.
Mm-hmm. It's a safe choice. What about Revolver is ranks it above things like Pepper or say Rubber Soul to you? Is it just the songs, or is there just something in particular that draws you back to Revolver?
I would say probably the songs and how they all flow together. And I don't know, there's just something special about listening to Revolver in terms of my enjoyment. I'd also have to put the White Album up there. Because it has a little bit of everything.
You can't ignore the White Album. You really can't.
Mm-mm.
Is your favourite Beatles song from Revolver as well?
My favourite Beatles song depends on my mood, so I can't really tell you what it is at the moment. It's been everything from Eleanor Rigby to a Day in the Life to I'm Only Sleeping. So it all varies.
I'm Only Sleeping is a good choice. One of my closest friends, his favourite song is I'm Only Sleeping as well. It's got something very hypnotic about it that just kind of keep drawing you back. What is your favourite solo McCartney album? Solo or with Wings?
So I differentiate between Paul solo and Wings. My favorite Paul solo album is Ram, and
of course,
my favorite Wings album is probably Venus and Mars, not including Wings Over America.
Venus and Mars. It does seem to me that the deeper I go into forums and the McCartney literature, that it is a very highly esteemed album. A lot more so than I initially thought going in. Like I always felt originally that it was going to be just the album they did after Band on the Run, but especially the first side. It's very solid. Obviously, McCartney heavy on the front. It is all of his songs, and it almost does feel like he's pushing the rest of the band back to the second disc. But Jimmy does make a nice statement on that album. He does feel like he's his own entity, and he is making a statement. So I can understand why you like that one. Do we know if Jimmy was working on any other songs with the band around that point, or was it just those two?
Well, I talked to Jimmy's brother when I was over in England, and I asked him if he had any songs that he was working on during the London Town sessions, and he said that he did, but I'm not sure what songs those were actually, because there's no real information out there on them.
There's nothing on the Water Wings bootleg or anything like that.
No, so
and obviously you have all of that on your YouTube channel. I I went through some of the videos on it yesterday, and I went back to you can click a button where it's like sort by earliest, and it's been going for 8 years now, which is kind of back to the earliest days of YouTube. And you've got some clips on there now that obviously accumulated views over time, as they are the easiest place to get a lot of Wings material. And it was one of the main reasons as why I wanted to get you on this show, was just to kind of obviously say thank you for that YouTube channel. Obviously there is no other thing on it on the website that has as many McCartney bootlegs and studio tapes and concert footage and a lot of candid interviews as well, and kind of radio rarities that again you really cannot find anywhere. So yeah, thank you for all of that. I wouldn't have had access to songs like Luxie if without your channel. I would have never known it had existed. Obviously you've been building this channel for 8 years now, and the major question I have is, where do you get half of that stuff from? I mean, some of that is really, really candid stuff.
Mostly bootleg forums. Bootleg Zone is my favorite.
Okay.
My favorite forum of choice, and they have pretty much everything there. So just do a search on there, and you'll find what you're looking for.
Now, before we move on to the album, there was one question I did neglect to ask you. What is your favourite solo McCartney song and your favourite Wings McCartney song?
That's a good question. My favorite solo McCartney song. Oh boy.
There are so many to choose from.
Yeah, there's so many.
How can you commit to just one? You'll disappoint so many others.
Yeah, anything from OOU on McCartney to Save Us from New.
Oh, okay. I was never a big fan of Save Us. I'm going to be talking about Save Us in a gig review that he did for the 2013 Tokyo Dome show, and I always felt Save Us felt a little bit forced compared to some of the other songs that appeared on that set list. I did like Queenie Eye. Queenie Eye was a very nice song from that album. It kind of had that old McCartney charm to it.
Yeah, Queenie Eye is a good song.
Did you like New? Were you a fan of New?
Yeah, I liked it quite a bit. I can't wait for his new album whenever that comes out, probably next year.
Yeah, with the song about Donald Trump on it, apparently. That sounds like it'll be something interesting. And obviously he's, 74 now? 73, 74? I'm so glad that he's still out there making music. And the thing with McCartney is, no matter how you receive the album the first time, whether you have to go back and revisit it in a few years, there are always those two solid songs that always happen straight away, even if you don't like the album as a whole. That just shows that you never wanted to stop, really.
Mm-hmm.